BBC Two re-examines the murder of Burmese leader Aung San and asks if the British were guilty of his murder.
"50 years ago, this man was leading Burma towards independence from Britain. He died in a hail of assassins' bullets. This Burmese politician was hanged for the crime. But did he and his gunmen really act alone, or were shadowy elements of the British establishment behind the plot?" In August 1988, the people of Burma defied decades of military oppression with one of the most remarkable popular uprisings of recent times. The demonstrators carried pictures of this man. General Aung San, the country's greatest hero, led Burma to independence from Britain and founded the army that rules today. The demonstrators believed if they carried pictures of Aung San, no soldier would harm them, but they were wrong. It's estimated that as many as 10,000 people were killed in the bloody slaughter that followed. But from the ashes of repression emerged a leader whose popularity was to gravely threaten the generals in Rangoon. Her name was Aung San Suu Kyi, daughter of the hero Aung San.
The reason why I got involved in the movement for democracy for Burma was because so many people here were looking back to my father as the only hope for them, so I felt I had a duty to help.
Amid a roundup of activists in 1989, Suu Kyi was placed under house arrest. Nevertheless, the pressure for elections was unstoppable, and the following year, her party, the National League for Democracy, won an overwhelming victory at the polls. But the generals refused to hand over power and kept Suu Kyi imprisoned. In 1991, she won the Nobel Prize for Peace. The regime finally released her 2 years ago, but hopes of a swift end to military rule were to prove short-lived. Now the situation is as desperate as ever. Suu Kyi, though free, remains under constant harassment by the authorities. In 1997, the people of Burma live in the shadow of fear. And it's been like this for 50 years, ever since Burma won independence from Britain. But it didn't always look that way. In January 1947, Suu Kyi's father, Aung San, led a delegation to London to negotiate independence with the Labour government of Clement Attlee. There were many in Britain, including opposition leader Winston Churchill, who would have had Aung San tried for war crimes. Less than 4 years earlier, he had presided as Minister of War in the Japanese-backed Burmese administration in Rangoon. During the fighting, his soldiers had killed thousands of ethnic minority Karens who had remained loyal to the British. In 1947, however, the Labour government was keen to do business with Aung San, and with him at the helm, the future of Burma looked promising. But 6 months after this film was taken, disaster struck. On the 19th of July 1947, Aung San was chairing a meeting of his cabinet when 3 gunmen burst in and opened fire. Aung San died later in hospital. He was just 32 years old. The assassination sent tremors around the world.
Aung San was irreplaceable. There was literally no one who could take Aung San's place as the leader and representative of the Burmese people.
The assassination was found to be the work of Aung San's political arch-rival. His name was U Saw. U Saw was tried and hanged, but now, 50 years later, a new witness suggests U Saw may not have been acting alone.
Well, he said, I was just let down, wasn't I? Government House let me down. I said, what do you mean let you down? They couldn't be a party to executions and assassinations. He said, well, look, there were certain indications to me that things would be all right.
And here at the Public Record Office in London, documents kept secret for nearly 50 years strengthen the suspicion that British interests were involved in the assassination of Aung San. In tonight's specially extended edition of East, we tell the remarkable story of Aung San and why it was some people in Britain wanted him dead. To make this film, we travelled to Rangoon. We had to go undercover because in Burma, perhaps more than anywhere else in the world, the past is the present. The ruling junta did not cooperate with our film about the founder of their national army. Many of Aung San's friends and colleagues who spoke to us were running considerable risks, even though they were talking of events 50 years ago and more.
If only he was not assassinated, Burma will not get into such trouble, I think.
For decades after Aung San's death, 10:37 on the morning of the 19th of July was the moment when all Burma stopped, remembered the country's greatest hero, and wept.
I felt my heart sank. Everybody in Rangoon, when we heard that, we just couldn't speak to one another.
When they have carried out Aung San's corpse with stretchers, I passed just inside the secretariat compound, and one secretary of the government ministry, Uchanda, made a remark. Saying,
and it's not just in Burma that the assassination is chillingly remembered.
We were sitting having a drink or something in an office that was very close to the council chamber, when we suddenly heard 2 or 3 bursts of automatic fire.
I heard this rattle, tattle, tattle. And I said to this man, I said, look, that sounds like machine gun fire. And he said, no, no, sir. He said, it's the derricks on the quay. Soon after that, somebody rushed into the CID office and said, quick, quick, there's a shooting in the chamber.
There was blood everywhere, quite frankly, and blood of a kind I'd never seen before, because the guns had been fired at very close quarters. There were bits of entrails, and parts of the table had been destroyed by the fire. There were sandals that had been kicked off, lying in the blood.
I saw Aung San's body. He was the only one I could see because the room was full of smoke caused by this firing.
The government in London was notified immediately.
This was the very worst Saturday afternoon I can remember in all my life. I was rung up from my office and told by my secretary that there was an urgent message for me from the governor of Burma. And the message, of course, was that the cabinet had been assassinated.
Suspicion soon centred on a rival politician, U Saw. U Saw had been Prime Minister before the war, but was now seeing power slip from his grasp. The assassins were spotted returning to U Saw's lakeside house in North Rangoon. That afternoon, the CID swooped to make an arrest.
As soon as I went, he was sitting down in a chair in a vest and a lungi, and he was drinking something which turned out to be whiskey. And as I went in there with my pistol, which would never have fired because it was so full of mud, having gone through very muddy water, he said, "What the hell are you doing here?" I said, "We are raiding your house."
U Saw and the gunmen were arrested. They all denied everything, but the following day the police dragged hundreds of automatic weapons from the lake beside his house. The police now began to investigate British officials with whom U Saw had been friendly. A military intelligence officer had actually telephoned U Saw during the assassination.
Because of some fluke on the telephone radio service, the whole conversation came over in the mess on the radio when everybody was there for elevenses. So when half an hour later they knew that there'd been the assassinations had just taken place and that U Saw was heavily under suspicion, there was somebody else under suspicion as well, and that was me. But that fortunately went away.
But evidence did begin to emerge of serious connivance by other British Army officers. A month earlier, a large consignment of Bren guns, enough for a small army, had been stolen from the Rangoon Ordnance Depot. The guns were taken by means of a forged authorization note. Some weeks later, 100,000 rounds of ammunition were stolen. Many of these guns and bullets were later found near U Saw's house, apparently part of a planned seizure of power. A British Army officer, Captain David Vivian, attached to the Burma police, was eventually found to have arranged the arms theft. But the weapons that killed Aung San and the cabinet were different. These were supplied to U Saw by another serving British officer, Major Henry Young. Vivian and Young were convicted and jailed for their part in U Saw's conspiracy, though Young was later released on a technicality. But were these relatively junior army officers the only British involved? One of Aung San's closest surviving colleagues is Brigadier Chaw Zaw. He defected to the Burmese Communist Party in the 1970s and is one of the current military regime's greatest enemies. He now lives in exile in China and isn't allowed to meet foreigners, so one day I phoned him at his house. Can I ask you, who do you think killed Aung San?
Yeah, who really killed Aung San was British government. It was their plot.
Why do you say that?
Aung San was the leader who could organize and unite the whole country. So they were afraid of whole Burma gets united. And they supposed that they could handle Burma more easily if they removed Aung San.
In Britain, that view is given short shrift by most who were involved at the time.
That, of course, was a complete misconception on the part of the Burmese.
There was no feeling, the British didn't think that they'd done anything wrong at all.
But there is now new evidence from one of the British police officers on the investigation that brings into question the accepted version of events. Carlyle Seppings remembers he was receiving information on other British officers' involvement, but he was restrained from questioning them by the Chief of Police.
He said, "Look, I don't want you to go anywhere near or arrest any British officers. This has got too big for both you and me. And if you dig deeper, we're going to tread on some very important corns."
Just 5 months after Aung San was killed, Winston Churchill made some damning remarks about him in the House of Commons during the debate on Burmese independence, a debate in which, incidentally, Churchill and the Conservatives opposed the granting of independence. It was an extraordinary comment, coming as it did so soon after Aung San's brutal murder. Churchill called him the traitor rebel leader of a quisling army and said, "I certainly did not expect to see Aung San, whose hands were dyed with British blood and loyal Burmese blood, marching up the steps of Buckingham Palace as the plenipotentiary of the Burmese government." Well, Winston Churchill didn't kill Aung San, though he clearly loathed him. But to find out who may have been pulling the strings back in London and why they so hated Aung San, we need to go back to the start of Aung San's turbulent political career. When Aung San came to study at Rangoon University in 1932, Burma had been fully conquered by Britain for not quite 50 years. The country was ruled as a province of the far larger imperial concern, India. But in 1935, in response to a rising tide of nationalism, London agreed to give Burma separate status. For many, like 20-year-old Aung San, it was not enough.
I think the ambition of most university students at that time was to become members of the civil service or to become professionals. But my father belonged to this new generation who were more political and who thought in terms of independence for the country rather than in terms of just a comfortable career for themselves under the colonial government.
While still a student, Aung San threw himself into anti-British politics. He joined the most radical nationalist grouping known as the Thakins.
The Thakin organization was formed because in those days, British authorities liked to be addressed as Thakins, masters, by their subordinates. So all these Thakin leaders claimed that we are the masters of our country, so you are not masters.
The Thakins led strikes and demonstrations all over Burma, but as World War II approached, they were still no closer to achieving independence. The outbreak of war in Europe offered new hope to the Thakins.
When the war broke out, we Thakins decided not to cooperate with the British. Our slogan was, Britain's misfortune is Burma's opportunity.
Aung San and the other leading Thakins immediately became Burma's most wanted men. Soon, most of the Thakins were behind bars. So Aung San and a fellow activist decided to escape from Burma. They stowed away on a boat bound for China and hoped to get support for their wild plans of a war of independence from Mao Zedong's Communist Party. But fate was to deal a different hand. The Japanese had been interested in Burma for some time due to their war with China. The Chinese were getting vital supplies from the British and the Americans through the Burma Road, which started in Rangoon and cut through to the hills of Yunnan. From early 1940, the Japanese had placed a secret intelligence unit in Burma. It was called the Minami Kikan.
The role of the Minami Kikan was to cut the Burma Road from Rangoon to Yunnan, and to do this by supporting the Burmese independence movement.
Aung San and his friend were duly picked up by Japanese agents after their ship docked and taken to Tokyo. There they planned an uprising against the British. The Japanese would support it, but first Aung San would have to find recruits for a secret army. Over the next few months, Japanese agents smuggled the recruits out of Rangoon Harbour, but it wasn't easy.
The ships were guarded at the gangways by British military police. I realized if we could get past them, we'd be all right. We would start fights and commotions in the town. Then we would smuggle them one by one.
In all, 30 Burmese Thakins were smuggled to the Japanese island of Hainan, where they were trained in strict secrecy.
In Hainan, we learned basic military training. The Japanese trained us in 3 areas: combat and warfare, intelligence, and administration.
However, the plan to re-enter Burma secretly and organize an uprising against the British kept being postponed for fear of jeopardizing Japan's far wider plans for a war throughout Asia. All became clear on December 7th, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, the plans changed dramatically. The Burmese Thakins would now invade Burma with the Japanese army. On the eve of the invasion, Aung San called the 30 Thakins together. That night, they became the legendary 30 Comrades, founders of the Burma Independence Army.
We became of the same flesh and blood. We had to recite an oath saying we were prepared to sacrifice our lives for our country, our people, and our army.
It was the first time since the days of the Burmese king that Burmese people were actually heading a patriotic fighting force.
When the British heard about us, they sentenced us to death in our absence. So we changed our names, and after that, the British didn't know who was who.
The Burma Independence Army entered Burma with the Japanese 15th Army. Thousands of other young Burmese nationalists joined as they advanced. They saw little fighting as the British gave only mild resistance, and civilians in the towns and villages were often welcoming. Meanwhile, the British found themselves totally unprepared to meet the Japanese invasion. In Rangoon, the recently appointed governor, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, did his best to keep order as the infrastructure of the country crumbled. This was the man who would become Aung San's bitter enemy after the war. Dorman Smith had been a Conservative Member of Parliament and Minister of Agriculture in the wartime cabinet.
The Conservative government obviously wanted to get rid of this no doubt slightly incompetent cabinet member, and thought it was the convenient way of doing it would be to dump him on Burma.
He liked anybody who entertained him and amused him, and anybody whom really he could patronize. He didn't like people on top. He liked people, he liked subordinates who would entertain him and so on. I must say this, that his judgments of people, I think, were so often totally wrong.
Dorman Smith had ruled the Burmese through his Prime Minister and close friend U Saw, who was later to hang for the murder of Aung San.
Anybody who was not Dorman Smith's creature was not acceptable to him. U Saw was his creature, and he liked him.
Dorman Smith led the evacuation of Burma and took the government to the Indian hill station Simla, where he planned for his eventual post-war return.
He sat in the clouds, more or less literally, in Simla, 7,000 feet, with his head joining his clouds, and planned a very, very theoretical constitution and reconstitution of Burma, in a nutshell. And none of his plans came to anything because the war ended too soon, and the political situation was such they were just totally impractical.
Meanwhile, in Burma, Aung San was now pressing his Japanese masters hard for independence and finding them very reluctant indeed.
We were only in Burma to drive the British out of India, not to give the Burmese independence. Reaching India would have been impossible for our military without a secure foothold in Burma.
Rangoon fell, but still the Japanese refused to deliver independence to the Burmese. Thakin Kin Aung met Aung San and found him angry.
We are being cheated. That's what he told me. The Japanese have broken their promise, he said.
We could have rebelled then and there, but we thought again. Even though we in the leadership were not satisfied with the Japanese, the Burmese people were at that point quite content.
But as the occupation continued, the Burmese people began to wonder whether they hadn't merely replaced one colonial master with another.
A lot of people had imagined that the Japanese, being fellow Asians, would bring them independence and they would be able to govern their own country. But in fact, what they saw was that the Japanese military administration was far worse than the British colonial administration.
But Aung San continued in the Japanese military government until finally, on August 1st, 1943, Burma was declared independent. Aung San was appointed Minister of War in the new administration. Independent Burma, recognized only by Japan and the Axis countries, immediately declared war on Britain and her allies. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the newfound independence brought no real freedom to the Burmese. A year later, the British offensive in northern Burma was making advances, and the fortunes of war began to swing against the Japanese. Aung San now made contact with the British and offered to rise against his former collaborators. Mountbatten, the supreme Allied commander in Southeast Asia, consulted the experts on Burma.
The advice was don't touch him with the bark bill, which would have been disastrous. They were there, and something had to be done. And the reason was there were a lot of anti-British communists and undesirables, and the moment that they've done their job against the Japanese, they're going to turn on us.
Anthony Eden, then Foreign Secretary, wrote to Prime Minister Churchill, "Surely we should not boost these people so much. They will give us great trouble hereafter." Churchill replied, "I cordially agree with you." But Mountbatten took his own line.
Mountbatten understood that my father was a force to be reckoned with within Burma, and I think he also accepted the fact that the Burmese army could be of considerable help to the Allied armies.
Churchill wrote in his diary some weeks later, "I hope Mountbatten is not going to meddle in Burmese politics."
Mountbatten told me that he had to be very careful to prevent the line he was taking on his initiative from getting back to Churchill in London, because he's quite certain that Churchill would then give him the sack.
At midnight on the 27th of March 1945, the rebellion went ahead, and some weeks later, Aung San crossed the Japanese lines to make direct contact with the British. General Slim later vividly described in his war memoir how Aung San justified his defection to the British as a response to Japanese ill treatment.
"Go on, Aung San," I said. "You only come to us because you see we are winning." "It wouldn't be much good coming to you if you weren't, would it?" he replied, simply. I could not question the truth of this.
But there is evidence that Aung San was planning to defect as early as mid-1943, long before the tide of war had turned against the Japanese. British intelligence in India were informed by their agent, Major Seagram.
Seagram was the British leader of the Karens in the hills to the east of Burma. And he had a first-hand report that Aung San in 1943 was preparing to turn on the Japanese.
Nevertheless, the view of Aung San as a Johnny-come-lately persisted.
The general impression in the British forces of Aung San and his merry men was that they had jumped on the bandwagon at the very last moment, and therefore, although we had to treat them with respect and this and that, they weren't really, they weren't a big deal.
In May, the British recaptured Rangoon and accepted the Japanese surrender. Aung San set about integrating his forces, now called the Anti-Fascist Organisation, into the British Army for continuing the war against the Japanese. For at that point, their total surrender still seemed a distant prospect. Then, everything changed.
The moment the bomb dropped, we were caught with our pants very badly down, because immediately the AFO and Aung San called a meeting of their committee, and they said this changes the situation totally. We got them, and they then called a meeting at in the Shwedagon Pagoda, the holy centre of Rangoon. Many people attended, and they passed a resolution by popular acclaim, A, that civil government should return to Burma immediately, and B, that a civil government should be formed composed of members of the resistance movement.
This was unacceptable to Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, who now returned from Simla to resume his governorship of Burma. By now, his relations with Mountbatten had greatly deteriorated, principally over the question of Aung San.
Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, Governor of Burma, meets Burmese leaders on board a British warship in Rangoon Harbour to discuss Burma's future.
But Dorman Smith preferred to work with pre-war moderates rather than Aung San, of whom...
He's a queer chap. I don't think he's quite all there. He was always a stormy sort of creature. Led student strikes and that sort of thing. But he's not a big enough man to lead this country, as, say, her First Dominion Prime Minister.
Dorman Smith, with support from the newly elected Labour government in London, was proposing direct rule for Burma, leading to independence at an unspecified future date.
It was, in effect, putting the government back to pre-war days. So I wasn't in the least surprised when the more extreme people like Aung San, as he was then regarded, should have rejected it out of hand.
After 3 months of stalemate, Dorman Smith called for his old friend U Saw, who'd spent the war in Uganda. He'd been interned by the British after he too had tried to contact the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. Eric Battersby brought him back.
And I was dispatched in the forlorn hope that he would be able to influence Aung San away from his extremist notions. This was total madness. It simply couldn't have happened. U Saw had no influence in Burma. He was yesterday's man. Aung San was in control.
On U Saw's return, Dorman Smith now decided to dig up Aung San's wartime past. During the 1942 invasion, many in the Burma Independence Army had run out of control and killed thousands of ethnic minority Karens in southern Burma. Historically, the Karens had been favoured by the British, and many Burmese nationalists regarded them as collaborators. Aung San did his best to halt the massacres, but he was far from blameless himself. Dorman Smith now assembled a dossier of evidence that Aung San had murdered a village headman during the 1942 invasion. Aung San, for his part, maintained he was merely carrying out a summary execution of a British collaborator. Dorman Smith ordered his arrest.
Well, Dorman Smith simply wanted to get rid of my father. He thought that if he could pin a charge of murder on my father, it would effectively remove him from the political scene. It would make him unpopular with the people, and I think he also expected to be able to take action against him, put him into prison. That was how he saw it, which was an indication of the fact that Dorman Smith simply didn't know what was going on in Burma.
I think he was possibly motivated most of all by hatred of Aung San, who represented all that he himself objected to and hated.
But before Aung San could be arrested, Prime Minister Clement Attlee consulted the file. He concluded that Dorman Smith had lost his grip and recalled him at once. Dorman Smith remained unrepentant and later wrote to a friend,
"We'd already hanged a number of Aung San's lesser colleagues for similar offences, and I failed to see why he shouldn't take his chances before a jury. We might have felt bound to exercise clemency had he been sentenced to death, but we could have dealt with that when the situation arose."
With Dorman Smith out of the way, Aung San and his renamed anti-fascist People's Freedom League were now firmly in control. They demanded immediate independence and came to London to get it.
My colleagues and I have come to London in response to the invitation of His Majesty's government in order to discuss the constitutional questions of Burma. The demand of our people is complete independence.
Attlee was impressed and gave Aung San what he wanted, a guarantee of independence within 1 year.
I've sometimes wondered what would have happened if the Conservative government had still been in power, because I think Churchill had been reluctant enough over India, but I think with the history of Burma, and this, as Churchill would have regarded him as a dangerous traitor, I doubt if his government would have so readily given in, as some people thought, to the demands of the Burmans.
Aung San was surprised too. Before leaving for London, he had laid plans for an armed rebellion to be activated had the talks not gone well.
A Burmese friend of mine told me that the start of the plans was to be the murder of as many as possible of British officers and their wives. And this friend of mine told me with gusts of laughter, I was to kill you and Nancy. Well, that took me somewhat aback, but he seemed to think it was a joke, so I thought I'd better treat it as a joke too. Still, I never felt quite the same about him.
Aung San returned from London to great acclaim, but by now Burma was set to leave the Commonwealth. While in England, he had told Mountbatten why.
He said, I have very sad news. I have to report to you I can't possibly keep Burma within the Commonwealth. I said, why not? He said, because things changed completely after you left. The governor took a violent, I don't say dislike, but he tried to persecute me. He tried to get evidence that I had committed crimes and atrocities so that he could try me, and I think he wanted to hang me. And it's very difficult, therefore, to work with somebody who you know has been trying to pin a murder rap on you and trying to liquidate you personally and refuse to deal with your party. Say, how can you stay within an empire whose representative is after you? I said, that's very, very sad.
After his dismissal, Dorman Smith continued to be involved in Burmese affairs. He took a great interest in the minority Karen's claim for their own separate state. Burma was and still is a country of many distinct ethnic groups, many of whom feel no connection with the majority Burmans. In southern Burma, the Karen, fearful of a repeat of the 1942 massacres, were committed to separation from the end of the war. When Aung San returned from London in 1947, he concluded an agreement with all the country's minorities that they would join the independent state of Burma with a measure of autonomy. There was, however, one group missing, the Karens, the so-called British collaborators of the war. The separatist claims of the Karens now became the main focus of a shadowy new group founded by Sir Reginald Dorman Smith shortly after the Aung San-Attlee Agreement. Based in London, it was called the Friends of the Burma Hill Peoples. The group was mainly made up of conservative politicians, soldiers and journalists. British intelligence watched this group closely from its inception. Back in Burma on the 24th of June, 200 Bren guns were stolen from the Army Ordnance Depot in Rangoon. This was the theft arranged by Captain Vivian and later traced to U Saw. Around this time, Major Hugh Toy visited U Saw and found him seething at Aung San's power.
He contrasted himself with what he thought of as this rather gauche upstart in Aung San. And I got the impression that he really meant to have power, but only when he could get it in a legitimate way.
On July the 14th, the arms thefts came to light. The following Saturday, Aung San was proposing the cabinet tighten security at the Secretariat when they were rudely interrupted. U Saw and 8 others stood trial for murder. Sir Reginald Dorman Smith offered to give evidence in his friend's defence, but was discouraged by the British government. U Saw was convicted of conspiracy to murder and sentenced to death. Dorman Smith intervened once more, this time to plead for clemency for his friend. The plea was rejected. On the day of the hanging in May 1948, the British ambassador in Rangoon wrote a secret telegram to Whitehall. That telegram has remained classified for nearly 50 years, until only a few months ago, the Foreign Office decided to release it to a researcher on this programme. The telegram reveals that the Chief of Police told the ambassador, and I quote, "We're now virtually convinced that there was British connivance in the assassinations." The police chief cites Sir Reginald Dorman Smith as a suspect. He believed the go-between was a man from the British Council in Rangoon called Bingley. Bingley hasn't featured so far in our story, but he will now. Soon after his arrest, U So, in desperation, started writing secret letters from his cell. First, he wrote to Captain Vivian in code. He said he wanted to contact the tall gentleman.
Everyone got very excited because who is this tall gentleman? That was a great mystery.
Vivian, who by now was also in prison for the arms theft, strongly advised against contacting the tall gentleman. U So then wrote to another British accomplice, Major Henry Young. Now the police chief decided to fake a reply. The ruse was successful. U So now wrote a letter and addressed it to John Stuart Bingley of the British Council, who happened to be 6 foot 3 inches tall. In the letter, U So threatened to make disclosures which would have international repercussions. An undercover police officer, posing as a released prisoner, delivered the letter.
He went very pale, tore up the letter into little bits, and then he shouted at this person and said, get out, you see.
The police chief, Tun Hla Aung, now insisted on interrogating Bingley. Bingley was evasive and denied involvement. Tun Hla Aung was dissatisfied and requested another interview. But the new governor, Sir Hubert Rance, insisted Bingley was a victim of circumstances and should be allowed to leave. The Burmese cabinet, fearful independence might be stalled, reluctantly agreed.
My father, for a long time, had lingering doubts, and because he wasn't satisfied that he was allowed to do everything that he had wished to do.
Tun Hla Aung decided to confront Bingley one last time on his own. He found him outside the Strand Hotel in Rangoon, preparing to leave for England. The police chief carried a second letter from U So, even more incriminating than the first.
I took a grave risk, as advised.
I think he was trying to get Bingley to say something. This was his last chance to get Bingley to admit.
But Bingley claimed diplomatic immunity and refused to answer the police chief's questions.
And finally, he was allowed to leave, and my father said, don't you ever come back to Burma.
John Stuart Bingley died in 1979 in Surrey. His internal reports on the assassination don't figure in the publicly available British Council files at the Public Record Office. Like Sir Reginald Dorman-Smith, Bingley was a keen supporter of Karen independence. Recently declassified documents from 1948 reveal that Sir Reginald's group, the Friends of the Burma Hill Peoples, was, according to British intelligence, involved in the armed overthrow of the government of independent Burma in support of the Karens. Many documents on this group still remain secret. But those released identify as key figures in the group 2 close associates of U So, his brother Mong Mong Ji and his defense lawyer Benjamin Vertanes. One person who knew much concerning the assassination was Aung San's close friend and secretary at the London talks, Bo Set-cha. Set-cha is now dead, but he told his story to an American journalist living in Bangkok in the 1960s.
Bo Set-cha told me that there was a very powerful group in London. These were people who, during the war, had been in the secret intelligence services. They had been involved diplomatically with Burma, militarily, and also with the Secret Service. Since that time, some of them had risen to the House of Lords. Others were very powerful in the upper reaches of the British government. But they were essentially left over from the Conservative government, and now, with the new Labour government, found themselves unable to act directly to influence British policy. So they had to act obliquely and in the shadows due to their determination to get revenge on Aung San and to prevent Aung San's triumphant independence for Burma.
And one other person involved in the Karen campaign who was also involved in U So's conspiracy was Captain David Vivian. Vivian escaped from prison in Burma and went to fight with the Karens. The Times reported him killed in an ambush by the Burmese army in 1950. But we've discovered a diary of his fighting days with the Karens up till 1954, and that he returned to Britain from Thailand in 1955 with false papers under the name of John Morgan. The Foreign Office files on Vivian have been destroyed, but the index shows the British Embassy in Bangkok knew he was evading a jail sentence in Burma. While in prison in Rangoon, Vivian had exorcised the British authorities when he claimed, "Someone in England is interested in seeing me put away and not allowed to talk. If I could tell the facts, there would be a big rumpus, especially between British and Burmese." Hoping to find out more about the mystery of Captain Vivian, I travelled to Durham University to consult a file on Vivian's 1955 return in the private papers of the British Commissioner General of Southeast Asia. Sure enough, there was a file marked Vivian, but I couldn't find the documents. Instead, I found this white card.
Dr. Fuster, no document on Captain Vivian, as there should be, just this piece of paper. Why?
Because after the papers were catalogued, the members of staff of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office examined them and retained a considerable number of papers on account of their sensitivity, and these papers that you're mentioning still have residual sensitivity.
The Foreign Office confirmed initially that the papers on Captain Vivian were to remain closed until the year 2005. But just before this programme was completed, that decision was reversed and the papers released. These confirmed that Captain Vivian was indeed smuggled back to London by the British government. But they still do not tell the whole story. The Foreign Office has, in its own words, made deletions where the text remains sensitive.
So what are we to make of the assassination of Aung San? Was he really killed, as most history saw it, by U Thaw alone, inflamed by revenge and jealousy, who then sat and waited at home after his gunmen returned? Or was U Thaw led to believe by powerful people, British people, who hated Aung San and all he stood for, that he would be called on to lead the government in the crisis that would inevitably follow? We'll probably never know who really killed Aung San. Too many people are now dead, too many files still kept secret by the British government. But one thing is certain, the people of Burma have paid a high price indeed for his death.
In January 1948, Burma became independent and left the Commonwealth. Within a year, the country was plunged into civil war and the minority peoples went into revolt. These conflicts spawned the brutal dictatorship which survives to this day.
I think that if my father had lived, democracy would have worked and it would have lasted. When we lost him, we lost our chance to build up a happy, democratic Burma. But of course, second chances always come, and we have to grab them while we can.